This is a 1994 BMW 730i, the E38 BMW 7 Series, which is one of my very favorite luxury cars of all time, except this one isn't particularly luxurious, with a small engine, manual transmission, cloth seats, and a lot of other basics instead of luxuries. This car was never sold here in the United States, but today I'm going to review it and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news! This 730i is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This is an unusual vehicle, a very special 730i, very common in the States, and it already has a US title and it's been imported here, so you don't have to go through any of that. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this E38 730i, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of this BMW 7 Series, and I'm going to start with the basics. So, the E38 BMW 7 Series was the brand's flagship luxury sedan, and it was sold in the United States from '95 to 2001, although sales started a little bit earlier in Europe. In fact, this was sold initially in Spain, and it's a 1994 model. Now, in the US, we only got the E38 7 Series in two flavors. There was the 740 model, which had a V8, or the 750 model, which had a V12. But in Europe, well, things were different. Like I mentioned, this is a 730i, but despite that name, which makes it seem like it might be a six-cylinder, like later 530 and 330 models, this actually has a V8. It was a small displacement 3-liter V8, and interestingly, this little V8 was offered in the United States in the 5 Series from this era. The E34 5 Series offered a 530i with this engine, but it was never sold in the 7 Series in the US, and with good reason. In the States, we want our luxury cars to have big power and big engines, and this just wasn't that. It had only 215 horsepower and 215 pound-feet of torque from the flagship BMW luxury sedan. Amazingly, this was not the least powerful engine that BMW offered in the E38 7 Series in Europe. There was also a 728i, which had a 6-cylinder, about 190 horsepower, and there was even a 725 TDS with a diesel 6-cylinder that had only 143 horsepower and 207 pound-feet of torque. None of that stuff ever would have worked in the US for the US consumer, but smaller engined, big luxury cars were more common in Europe at the time, including this one. Now, from the eye of an American looking at this car, there are quite a few interesting quirks and features about it. But we'll start on the outside, where probably the most obvious one is its color. It's green, specifically Oxford green. That's what BMW called this color, and it's certainly unusual. Most full-size luxury sedans from this period were silver, gray, black, maybe white. It wasn't common that you saw green, but maybe on the lower-end versions like this, you had more colorful characters instead of the executive businessmen who got silver, and so green maybe was more common. Plus, this car was sold new to Spain, where they have a little more personality than the Germans, and so maybe they thought green was kind of a way to spice things up. Unfortunately, the rest of the car isn't very spicy. These wheels were never offered on any E38 7 Series here in the States. They're small, only 16-inch wheels, and they don't look very exciting or sporty, just sort of functional, get the job done. And they certainly reveal this isn't exactly the most high-end, opulent version of the 7 Series. But despite that, despite the unusual color and the small wheels, this car still is beautiful. The E38 BMW 7 Series has some of the best body lines of any full-size luxury sedan ever, at least in my opinion, and this car still has those lines. You can put on small wheels and a green color, but you'll still look good if you're an E38. It was just a gorgeous car no matter what form you got it in, even this one. And next we move inside this 730i, and that's where the base model stripped down car fun really starts. You open the door and the first and most obvious thing you notice in here, cloth seats, cloth upholstery in a BMW 7 Series. It doesn't compute in your mind, but that's what it has. That's what the cheaper versions of this car had in Europe, although certainly never in the States. And you have manual seats, as you can see, all of the manual controls over on the side. You don't get powered seats, you don't get automated lumbar support, you don't get seat memory, you're just pulling latches and throwing your body weight like you're in some sort of cheapie. Also, of course, you see the manual transmission. You get a 5-speed manual here hooked up to this little V8 rear-wheel drive, and once again, this was not offered in the US. There was no manual transmission E38 available in the States, so to see a manual in this car inside this interior, it doesn't make sense from an American perspective, but there it is. You also have manual climate control, dual zone climate control, driver and passenger, which is a nice touch, but manually operated. You set the fan speed, you set the climate temperature, and you had to kind of work to moderate the temperature. There was no auto setting here you could just set it to. You were doing it yourself in a BMW 7 Series. Next up, here's another interesting one. This little panel here. In basically every nice BMW from this era that you get into, there's a display screen here and a row of buttons below that you can select what you want to see, like your fuel range or how long you've been driving for, your current fuel economy, various different car information. But in this 7 Series, that screen is gone, not included. Instead, you have this panel which you can open up for a coin slot. You didn't even get your little information display screen. And there's no information display screen in the gauge cluster either. In most BMW models from this era, this little pixelated display screen at the bottom of the cluster will show, again, various vehicle information, your fuel economy, your trip odometer, etc. You press the end of the turn signal stalk and it displays different info. But in this car, you can't press the end of the turn signal stalk and you can't get anything to show up here. So this car has no onboard trip computer or driving range estimate, how much fuel you have left, or fuel economy readout and average over time. You don't get any of that, even though you got a 7 Series. And also another thing you won't find in this car, a sunroof. I think that every US market E38 had a sunroof, but if not, virtually all of them did. Not here though, no sunroof at all. This is a slick top. Now, beyond the base model stuff in this car, some of the interesting quirks in this interior relate to panels that hide stuff. So we start in the center control stack where I showed you that coin slot. Interestingly, you can put down a panel and cover it along with a portion of the radio. If you just want to see some of your radio, you can have it displayed and show basically your radio presets and your volume dial. If you open up this panel, you can see more radio options that you can adjust, but if for some reason you don't want to be looking at them, you can close that panel and you don't have to see them. Next up, also in the center control stack that's interesting, this panel reveals cup holders. You press it and they pop out, which actually was a pretty nice luxury touch because a lot of German cars from this era didn't have cup holders. BMW and other German automakers thought that when you're driving, you should be focused on driving, and so they didn't give cup holders for fat Americans who like to drink soda while they drive. But I guess by the time this car came out, they were doing cup holders. Of course, the funny thing about that always was that every German car from this era has like 7 ashtrays. It was okay to smoke while you were driving, according to the Germans, just not drink. Anyway, other interesting panels. In the center, this panel here, this is a little storage compartment. You can open it up and then storage is revealed. And this panel reveals an ashtray. And when you open it, the ashtray actually rises up to greet you and says, "Hello, I'm an ashtray." Now, the center console in this car is unusual. It doesn't work in the traditional way. You can't actually open it all the way up like most center consoles. Instead, there's a latch in the front, but you can only use that to slide it forward or backward to position it as an armrest. If you want to open the center console, you press this button here on the side, and then it pops open, revealing a wide variety of €2 coins that apparently nobody wants. Even in Spain, where this car came from. They said, ship it with the coins. I don't need them. Now, also unusual when it comes to storage in this car is the glove box, which is a bizarre E38 BMW 7 Series hallmark. I say that because you open it up and it opens strangely. It sort of pulls out and then goes down in an odd motion. The way that it operates is so weird, and it has a hydraulic, which was supposed to make it sort of open gracefully instead of most glove boxes that just slam open. That was on all the E38 7 Series models. I've seen it before, and it never stops being weird. It was definitely a strange decision. Now, in this glove box, you also have a flashlight. As you can see, it doesn't work. None of these BMW glove box flashlights ever work, but it was there and you could use it, which was a nice luxury touch. And in fact, despite this being a super base model, stripped out, decontented 7 Series, it did have a few nice luxuries. It is, after all, a 7 Series. One is the power windows. They are all automatic down and automatic up on the driver's door panel. You press any one of those, it auto downs, and you can bring it auto back up, even for the back seats. You also had steering wheel controls for your audio, your volume, next track, and your cruise control, which was a nice, convenient touch that this car offered. In addition, you had keyless entry. You couldn't walk up to the car and just leave the key in your pocket, but you did have buttons on the key fob to unlock and lock the door, so you didn't actually have to use the physical key. Back in the day, they called that keyless entry. Of course, now it is truly keyless, but it was a nice touch. Another nice touch is the door storage situation. You have two pockets in the front doors. One is open for your stuff, and the other is closed for your stuff that you don't want other people to see. And the last nice feature in this car is frankly just the way it's built. This era of BMW models was solidly built and just felt good. And even driving this car 30 years later with over 120,000 miles, it still feels solid, well built, well designed, well screwed together with nice materials in here. That was true of every 7 Series, from the V12 all the way down to, well, this. And next we move on to the back seat of the E38 730i, where once again you discover cloth upholstery, which still seems alien, just like it did up front. You have this rear cloth bench seat, and it just doesn't make sense in your mind that it isn't leather, but indeed it isn't. Now, one thing it does have in common with all the other 7 Series models, there's a lot of space back here. You have a lot of room in the back of your 7 Series. Even though this isn't the long wheelbase IL model, you still have a lot of space to be comfortable and relax in the back of this car. It was, after all, physically large, and no matter how cheap and decontented it was, you couldn't really get away from that fact. So it is pretty spacious. And you did have a few nice luxury touches back here. For one, you got a reading light, individual reading lights, in fact, on either side of the back seat, so rear passengers could sit here and, well, read and see. You also have a rear climate vent, which was a nice touch, especially for this era. You didn't always get that, even in high-end cars, but you have it here. And of course, you have a rear seat cigarette lighter, as you can see, and individual rear ashtrays on each rear door, because no matter how cheap you got a base model car in Europe in the 90s, you had to have many ashtrays. It was an absolute requirement. Now, one interesting thing about this car and other E38s is the seatbelt situation. Specifically, the seatbelts come out from the center of the rear bench seat, and they plug into the buckle over on the side, on the outboard side by the door. This is the opposite of how basically every other car does it, where the seatbelt obviously is closer to the door and you put it over your shoulder and it buckles in the middle. Now, I don't know why BMW did this. I'm told it's to make it easier for first responders. If you get into a collision, it's easier to cut the seatbelt from an unconscious passenger at one point near the door instead of multiple points when they open up the door to try to let you out. That's what I'm told. I don't know if it's true, but it is interesting, and it's definitely distinctive and different, but a lot of BMWs from this era had that. And finally, we move on to the trunk of the 730i, which you can open up on the key fob, and then it pops open and you lift it the rest of the way. Now this trunk is not particularly interesting, although it does have a few quirks worth noting. One is, the size. It's large. You get a big sedan, you want a big trunk, and this one has it. You also get a little cargo net here, as you can see, for smaller items if you don't want them rolling around, and a couple of rubberized tie-downs that can keep other stuff in place on the floor of the trunk. And there's some little pockets on the side, a larger one on the left, a smaller one on the right, where you can stick smaller stuff, again, if you kind of want it in its own place and not rolling around with the rest of the stuff in your trunk. But the most interesting trunk-related item in this car, and in basically all BMW models from this era, is on the inside of the trunk lid, and it's this big plastic panel. You twist the screw at the top of this panel to open it up, and it reveals a toolkit, a full toolkit, so you can work on this car roadside if something happens. And one thing I love is how the toolkit lays flat when it's open to make it easy to find your tools, access them, and work on your car. I also like the fact that inside the toolkit there is a diagram of an old school 7 Series. This is an E38 model, they call it, from the late 70s, and probably this toolkit was first used in that car, which is why it's the diagram picture, and then they just used it in other cars after that and never bothered to change the picture. But it's interesting to see that and the toolkit in general, which could be a useful feature in a lot of situations. All right, driving the E38 730i. It doesn't even sound right to say. I've been saying 740, 750 my whole life for 28 years of this car being in production, 30 years basically. And now I'm driving a 730, which I am so excited about. When I heard that this car sold on Cars and Bids a couple of years ago to the guy who's selling it now. And when I heard that he was selling it again, I was like, please, please let me review it. I want to drive this car so badly because I'm just curious. I love the E38. I've spent a lot of time around E38s. I've done several videos with E38s. But obviously I've never been in the cloth seat, climate controlled dial, manual seat, manual transmission, 6-cylinder, decontented, no sunroof version. And I was like, I just want to know. I want to know what it's like. And I gotta say, my first impression is surprisingly favorable. It isn't that slow, actually. And it feels surprisingly like smooth and quiet, like you would expect from a big sedan. I mean, even though it was the decontented version of the E38 7 Series, it was still a big BMW sedan, and they knew they were going to have to sell this globally and make it be a top-of-the-range model in a lot of markets. And so it had to have those features and that, comfort and that kind of feel of a car like this. And I got to tell you, it kind of does. I'm shocked at just how comfortable the ride is. I'm shocked at how quiet it is in here. Just because it's decontented, you still get the nice benefits of a full-size luxury sedan. And I gotta say also, this powertrain is pretty good. It was a good engine. BMW offered this engine in the United States in the 530i. And so this engine did exist here. It was rare, but it did exist. And it was a little V8, and it moved that car pretty well. 530i's from that era are considered to be actually quite sporty cars. And in this car, it's bigger, but it's not so much bigger that it takes the sporty out of that powertrain. It still feels pretty nice. Now, with that said, the drawback here is steering precision isn't exactly on the level of an E34, which in itself didn't have the most precise steering, but it's still like a relatively tossable car. I'm kind of surprised by how much I like the engine. It's smooth. It's not like really fast, but it feels like a good cruiser engine, and it's smooth to get up to power. Doesn't feel like there's anything wrong with it, which is nice. A BMW from this area, you're never quite sure. And also, I kind of like the operation of the clutch and shifter in this car. There are some BMWs, especially some of the more recent ones, that I've not been a big fan of how the manual really operates. The clutch is kind of annoying and kinked, and the shifter is rubbery. This car is not really like that. The shifter is pretty good. It's pretty precise, and it goes into gear well, relatively notchy. And the clutch, it's not quite as linear travel as I want it to be. Porsche clutches are so good. They're just perfectly linear, and you know exactly where the bite point is. You can find it immediately. This car is a little bit less like that, a little bit of a kind of kink, and then it goes the rest of the way. It's not quite as smooth, but it's not so bad. One of the reasons I wanted to drive this car is because I was thinking to myself, I've always loved the E38. It drives reasonably well. What if you threw a manual in it? The enthusiast in you is always like, oh, any car is better with a manual. But here it was like, well, this is kind of a decontented, small wheels, crappy version. Is it really gonna be better with a manual? And I gotta say, yeah, it actually is. The E38 wasn't a huge car. I mean, it's a 7 Series, but it's not so massive like modern 7 Series that it's just like unwieldy and uncontrollable. I find myself actually really liking this car. And I love the build quality of BMWs from this era. This was back before technology became the king leader of the luxury segment, when just well screwed together high-end build quality was the way you defined yourself. And Mercedes-Benz owned it. And BMW, in order to keep up, had to also get there. And so BMWs from kind of the early mid-90s were, not necessarily from a reliability perspective, but from like an interior materials and touch points perspective, they were excellent at quality. They just felt so sturdy. And this car definitely has that feel. I like this car. I really kind of like it a lot. And so that's the E38 BMW 730i, the stripped down base model with a manual transmission and cloth seats. This is so unlike the E38 7 Series that we got in the States that it almost feels like it should be forbidden. And it's very cool to spend the day checking this out. And you can buy this 730i on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give this BMW a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 50 out of 100, which puts the 730i manual here against some relevant cars. Overall, it doesn't stand up well to more exciting and engaging cars like the E34 BMW M5 or the E38 7 Series with a V12, but it's still reasonably fun to drive, attractive, well-built, and of course it has that it factor on account of the base model spec and the manual transmission. I enjoyed this car more than I expected, more than the numbers would suggest on paper, and it was fun to see just how stripped down a full-size luxury car BMW 7 Series could be in the rest of the world.